The night was quiet until the red and blue lights flashed outside his window. "Put your hands where I can see them." The officer's voice was cold, sharp. Jamal stood frozen, his heartbeat thudding in his ears. He had done nothing wrong, but in this neighborhood, innocence meant nothing. Tonight, justice would be tested in ways no one saw coming. Jamal Richardson was no stranger to hard work. A respected schoolteacher, he had recently bought his first home in a quiet, suburban neighborhood, a place where he had hoped to build a future. But here, he was still a stranger. To some, he was still an outsider. That night, he had just returned from a long day at work. As he locked his car and walked up his driveway, he noticed his neighbor, Mr. Thornton, watching from his porch. The glare was familiar, one of quiet disapproval, of something unspoken but understood. Jamal ignored it, sighing as he stepped inside. Then came the flashing lights. Within seconds, a squad car screeched to a stop in front of his house. The officers spilled out, hands hovering near their holsters. "Put your hands where I can see them," one of them barked. Jamal barely had time to register what was happening before they were on him, hands rough against his arms, pushing him against his own front door. "We got a report of a suspicious individual matching your description," one officer said. "What's your business here?" "My business?" Jamal exhaled slowly, forcing himself to stay calm. "I live here." They didn't believe him. Demands for ID, questions fired like bullets, accusations hanging in the air. But as Jamal struggled to keep his composure, something caught his attention. Mr. Thornton. The old man stood on his porch watching the chaos unfold, and for the first time, he looked nervous. Why? Jamal's fingers clenched into fists as the officers surrounded him. His pulse pounded, but he refused to let them see his fear. Fear could be dangerous in situations like this. "I told you I live here," he said, forcing his voice to remain steady. "Yeah?" One of the officers, a stocky man with a square jaw, sneered. "Then why did we get a call saying you were trying to break in?" From the corner of his eye, Jamal saw Mr. Thornton leaning against his porch railing, watching with a smirk of satisfaction. Jamal's jaw tightened. He called them. Of course he did. The officers weren't listening. One of them yanked his wallet from his pocket, pulling out his ID. "Jamal Richardson, huh?" The officer eyed the card before looking at him again. "What do you do for work?" "I'm a teacher." The officer scoffed, unimpressed. "Oh, yeah? Got proof?" Jamal gritted his teeth. "What more proof do you need?" But before he could say another word, a voice cut through the tension. "Wait." Everyone turned. Across the street, a middle-aged woman stepped off her porch, pointing at the house next door. "My security camera, it caught everything." Silence. Jamal felt a shift in the air. "You have footage?" one officer asked, hesitating. "Yes, it's pointed toward this house. I saw him come home, go inside. He didn't do anything." Jamal's heartbeat surged with hope. Maybe, just maybe, this nightmare would end. But the lead officer didn't budge. "We still have to run a background check," he muttered. "Standard procedure." Jamal stiffened. Standard procedure? They had evidence proving he was innocent, yet they still weren't letting this go? Something cold settled in his gut, and then another car pulled up, a second squad car. Tension thickened. The new officers stepped out, exchanging glances with the first group. Something was happening, something bigger than just a misunderstanding. Jamal turned his gaze back to Mr. Thornton. The old man had gone rigid, his smirk wiped away. His fingers twitched nervously as the second set of officers approached. Jamal narrowed his eyes. Why does he look worried now? Then, a new voice. "Excuse me." Another person, this time, a delivery driver who had been parked a few houses down. He hesitated before speaking again. "I was dropping off a package earlier. I saw it too. That guy, he pointed at Mr. Thornton. He was the one acting suspicious, not him." The lead officer frowned. What do you mean? I saw him pacing back and forth, looking nervous. When the guy, Jamal, came home, he went inside normally. But the old guy, he looked like he was waiting for something. A flicker of realization crossed one of the younger officers' faces, but he stayed silent, watching. Jamal's mind raced. Why was Thornton watching him so closely? Why did he look worried now that more cops were here? And then it clicked. The sudden nervousness, the police's persistence. They weren't just here for Jamal. They were already investigating something else. Jamal turned fully toward Thornton, eyes locked. You called the police on me to keep them distracted, didn't you? Thornton's face twitched. What? That's ridiculous. Jamal took a step forward. What are you hiding? A flicker of something flashed in Thornton's eyes, panic. And in that moment, Jamal knew. This wasn't just about race. Thornton had something to hide, something serious, and karma was about to catch up to him. Jamal had had enough. He turned to face Mr. Thornton fully, his chest rising and falling with slow, controlled breaths. His patience was gone. His fear had burned away. You called them on me to cover up something, didn't you? Thornton scoffed, but there was a slight tremble in his posture now. His fingers twitched at his sides. You people always play the victim, he spat. I called the police because I saw something suspicious. Jamal took a step closer. The officers watched, silent. What exactly did you see? Jamal's voice was steady, unshaken. Me coming home from work? Unlocking my own door? Or were you just hoping they'd rough me up so they wouldn't look too closely at whatever's going on inside your house? Thornton's face twitched. Shut up. Jamal tilted his head. Why so nervous, Mr. Thornton? The delivery driver chimed in. Yeah, man, you've been acting weird all day. The officers exchanged glances. One of them, the younger cop who had been silent earlier, finally spoke. We actually do have an open case linked to this address. The words sent a ripple of tension through the air. Jamal's heart pounded. I knew it. Thornton's expression faltered. That's ridiculous. You should be dealing with him. He's the one creeping around. He pointed at Jamal, desperation leaking into his voice. The lead officer held up a hand. We're the ones who decide who's a suspect. He turned to the radio attached to his vest. Dispatch, what's the status on that open case linked to this address? Crackling static. Then, suspect tied to multiple fraud allegations. Possible drug distribution under investigation. Officers advised to proceed with caution. Jamal exhaled sharply. Thornton's face went pale. That's insane. I have nothing to do with that. One of the officers took a step toward him. Sir, we're going to need you to stay right where you are. Thornton's eyes darted wildly, calculating. Then he ran. Everything happened at once. Stop. The officers bolted after him, but Thornton was fast for his age, scrambling toward his back door. Jamal turned just in time to see one of the younger officers tackle him to the ground. Thornton fought, kicking and thrashing. You idiots! He's the criminal, not me! But the officers weren't listening anymore. One of them pulled out handcuffs, snapping them around Thornton's wrists. Jamal stood frozen, his mind reeling. This man had called the police to frame him, had weaponized the system against him, and in the end, he had outed himself. Karma had arrived. The officers hoisted Thornton up, dragging him toward the squad car. Jamal locked eyes with him one last time. For the first time that night, Mr. Thornton wasn't smirking. Jamal watched as the officers shoved Thornton into the back of the squad car. The old man thrashed, screaming protests that no one was listening to anymore. The same cops who had been ready to arrest Jamal just minutes ago were now turning their focus to the real criminal. But something still felt unfinished. Jamal crossed his arms, his mind racing. He tried to frame me, he muttered, but why? One of the younger officers, the one who had seemed hesitant earlier, looked up sharply. That's a good question. he said. His name tag read Officer Brooks. Jamal met his gaze. If I hadn't kept my cool, if that woman across the street hadn't had a security camera, you guys would have hauled me off in cuffs, wouldn't you? Brooks didn't deny it. His jaw tightened, but he said nothing. Then the police radio crackled again. Dispatch to Officer Reynolds. We traced the anonymous call that reported the suspicious activity. It came from a burner phone linked to a William Thornton. A heavy silence settled over the officers. He called it in himself. Brooks whispered, eyes widening. He planned this. Jamal let out a humorless chuckle. So what now? You admit you made a mistake? The lead officer, Reynolds, shifted uncomfortably. His gaze flickered between Jamal and the squad car, as if weighing his next move carefully. And then, suddenly, "Sir, we need to check something." Jamal turned to see another officer walking out of Thornton's house, holding something in his gloved hands. A stack of mail, envelopes with official-looking stamps. Brooks took one and read aloud, "Final notice, foreclosure proceedings." Jamal's eyebrows lifted. "So that's it," he murmured. "He's losing the house." Everything clicked into place. Thornton had tried to frame Jamal, not just out of racism, but out of sheer desperation. If the neighborhood turned against Jamal, if they forced him to move, Thornton could have spun it into leverage, maybe to get an extension, maybe for sympathy from the HOA, maybe for something else entirely. But Jamal wasn't the real problem. Thornton himself was drowning. And then, another revelation. Brooks frowned as he flipped through another envelope. His eyes darkened. "Sir," he called out, stepping toward Reynolds, "there's more." Reynolds took the envelope, opening it carefully. His expression hardened. "This isn't just about foreclosure," he said. "This guy, he's been under federal investigation." Jamal's stomach dropped. "For what?" Brooks inhaled sharply. "Fraud, bank scams, money laundering." A chill ran through Jamal. Thornton wasn't just a bitter old man who resented a black homeowner in his neighborhood. He was a criminal, one who had been inches away from getting caught, and he had nearly ruined Jamal's life just to buy himself a little more time. Officer Reynolds exhaled and rubbed a hand down his face. "Shit," he muttered. "Child, we need to get a search warrant for this house. Something tells me this is bigger than we thought." But before anyone could move, another officer emerged from the house. "Sir, we might have a problem." The group turned as the officer held up a small plastic bag. Sealed evidence. Inside was a phone, a second burner phone. Reynolds frowned. "What is that?" "A second burner. And it's got recent outgoing calls. One of them went to a name flagged in the system, a man named Derek Coleman." Silence. Jamal didn't recognize the name, but the reaction from the officers told him everything he needed to know. "Who's Derek Coleman?" he asked. Brooks cleared his throat. "He's a known associate of a money laundering ring," Brooks said. "But that's not the worst part." Jamal frowned. "What is?" Brooks met his gaze, his expression grim. "He went missing 2 weeks ago." A chill crept down Jamal's spine. Missing, as in vanished. Something deeper was at play here, and it wasn't over yet. Jamal stood still, his hands clenched into fists at his sides. The tension in the air was thick, suffocating. The officers exchanged glances, the reality of the situation sinking in. The man they had almost arrested without evidence, without question, had been innocent all along. And the man who had called in the fake report? A wanted criminal. Officer Reynolds stepped toward the squad car where Thornton sat, his face flushed red with rage. "William Thornton, step out of the vehicle." Thornton scoffed. "What the hell are you talking about? You already arrested me. This is harassment." But Reynolds wasn't listening. He nodded to another officer who yanked open the car door and pulled Thornton out. This time, the grip on his arms wasn't polite. "You're being placed under arrest for fraud, money laundering, and obstruction of justice," Reynolds said, his voice cold and sharp. We have reason to believe you are connected to a larger criminal network. Anything you say can and will be used against you in a court of law." Jamal watched as they forced Thornton against the side of the squad car, his arms pinned behind him, the metal of the handcuffs clicking into place, just like they had tried to do to him. The irony wasn't lost on anyone. "This is bullshit," Thornton shouted, his voice losing its bravado. He looked around desperately as if searching for someone, anyone, to back him up. No one did. Officer Brooks stepped closer, a file in his hands. He flipped it open and held up a paper. "We just got a hit on your fingerprints," Brooks said. "This isn't your first time screwing people over, is it?" Thornton's face went rigid. "Fraud case from 5 years ago. Looks like you dodged that charge on a technicality." Brooks continued to chew. "But guess what? The feds have been looking at you again, and now you just gave them exactly what they needed." Jamal inhaled slowly, letting the moment settle. Justice. For a moment, Thornton just stood there, stunned. His entire world was crumbling around him. The power he had once wielded, the privilege, the ability to call the cops on an innocent black man without consequence, was gone. And Jamal? He stood tall, unmoving, watching as the man who had tried to destroy his life was finally getting what he deserved. Thornton's eyes locked onto him. There was no more arrogance in them, no more smirks, just pure, seething hatred. "You think you won?" Thornton spat. "You think this changes anything?" Jamal tilted his head. "I don't think," he said. "I know." The doors to the squad car slammed shut as the officers hauled Thornton away. The sound was final, echoing into the cold night air. Jamal exhaled, shaking his head. He had come home tonight expecting nothing more than a quiet evening. Instead, he had been forced to fight for his dignity, his innocence, his very existence in a place that was supposed to be his home. But now the truth was out, and the real criminal was gone. For the first time that night, he let himself smile. The neighborhood was quiet again. No flashing lights, no shouting officers, just the distant hum of crickets and the occasional rustle of the wind through the trees. Jamal stood on his front porch, arms crossed, as he watched the last police car pull away, carrying William Thornton toward the fate he had so desperately tried to escape. Justice had been served. But as Jamal turned his gaze toward the row of houses lining the street, he could feel the weight of unseen eyes. Curtains twitched, porch lights flicked off. Some neighbors had come out earlier, pretending to be concerned citizens. Others had stayed hidden, watching from the shadows, unwilling to get involved. Now they all knew the truth. Some would learn from it. Others would pretend nothing had happened. Jamal didn't care. He inhaled deeply, then exhaled, letting go of the tension that had gripped him all night. He was still standing, still here. As he stepped down from his porch, his feet carried him past Thornton's house. It was dark now, lifeless, empty. A place that once held power, now just another home waiting for its next owner. Jamal paused for a moment, looking at it. Then, with a small, knowing smile, he turned away. Karma had done its job, and so had he. Jamal took one last glance at Thornton's now empty house, shaking his head. But just as he turned to walk away, his phone buzzed. A message from Officer Brooks. It was a file, an attachment. Jamal's brows furrowed as he tapped it open. His breath caught. Bank statements, property records, an offshore account under William Thornton's name. And the biggest twist of all, one of the deposit was made 2 weeks ago. The same time Derek Coleman, the missing money launderer, had disappeared. Karma wasn't just coming for Thornton. The FBI was. Jamal smirked. Thornton had thought he could manipulate the system. But the system was about to bury him. Before I reveal how Karma served the ultimate justice, hit subscribe, because you won't believe the twist that comes next.